This is Kick-Ass News. I'm Ben Mathis. As the world goes into lockdown amid the COVID-19 pandemic, one prominent American has been stuck in quarantine at the epicenter of the European crisis in Italy. Former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich has been reporting on that country's battle with the coronavirus from Rome, where his wife Callista serves as the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican. Being a diplomatic spouse has also given him more time to work on his writing, including a hit series of political thrillers that he co-writes with former Washington Post reporter Peter Early. Their latest action-packed edition just hit the shelves, and it's not a bad way to enjoy a little escapism during these stressful times. It's titled Shakedown, a Novel. And today, Newt Gingrich returns to the podcast to discuss why he's coming back with a sequel starring the former Navy SEAL and FBI agent from his previous novel, Collusion. A former history professor, he shares how top-secret military research from World War II and the Cold War inspired the plot of his latest book, Why the Russians Make the Perfect Perennial Villains, and how the murderous Iranian General Qasem Soleimani was assassinated in January but still lives on in Newt's fiction. He gives a full account of the conditions in Italy amid that country's ongoing coronavirus nightmare, some lessons that Americans can learn from Italy's early failure to stop the spread, and South Korea's successful containment of the virus, and his own theory on how COVID-19 made its way from China to Milan. He also talks about how the pandemic will affect U.S. China Relations, how he hopes it could lead to regime change in Iran, and how to best address the economic impact here at home. Coming up with former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich in just a moment. Today I'm welcoming back to the show former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich. He is also a Fox News contributor, the host of the podcast Newt's World, and a New York Times best-selling author. His latest book is the second in his new series of political thrillers, which he co-authored with former Washington Post reporter Peter Early. It's called Shakedown, a Novel. Today he's joining me over the phone from Rome, where his wife Callista serves as U.S. ambassador to the Holy See, and the Gingriches are under quarantine just like the rest of Italy amid the COVID-19 crisis. Newt, welcome back to the show, and how you holding up under the circumstances?
Well, I think we're doing pretty well. We're having to really be careful. Callista led the embassy in a series of real changes, and they're now literally every one of them working from home. I'm working from home. The system here has closed everything except grocery stores, pharmacies, and gas stations. You can be fined up to $8,000 if you're on the street without a good reason. So they're really being very tough about getting people to stay home. The virus got so out of control here that they really had to get deeply involved. And I think that it is really important that we recognize that in a place, for example, like New York, you have to go to very, very strong controls, and otherwise it can get out of control. Now, our hope is that they're about to turn the corner here. Other places have done a better job, frankly, but when the Italians realized how big the problem was, they did rise to the occasion, and I think that it has been impressive. Frankly, it's been impressive how much the Italian people have responded and accepted that it's a it's a real problem.
Yeah, because the Italian culture, kind of tends to take most things in stride. So I can't imagine that this is the sort of thing that comes naturally to them. But I think that I read that over the past 2 or 3 days, they've actually started to report fewer new infections.
Yeah, well, we've had a slowdown in new infections. I haven't heard the numbers for today yet. They come out just about now, actually. But there's some hope. The number who are dying is going to keep going up because the fact is that's a lagging indicator. That tells you how many people got sick 10 days or 2 weeks ago. But it is people were moderately encouraged. It was still going up, but it was starting to go up slower.
And Italy has been the hardest hit country in Europe, and yet at first, as you sort of alluded to, they were a little slow to take aggressive measures needed to flatten that curve. What do you think the U.S. can learn from Italy's initial mistakes?
Well, there's an interesting contrast in that the Italians, partly out of political correctness, were very slow because there are about 100,000 Chinese who live in northern Italy. When the Chinese bought the Italian high-end brands of purses and shoes and what have you, they wanted to be able to continue to say made in Italy. So they just moved the workers to Italy. And as a result, early on, the government didn't want to close the trips to Wuhan. Wuhan was a major center of providing the workers. And so they had a much deeper entrenched problem in the early days. And a lot of it was in small villages, and it didn't sort of leap up and scare them. And then finally they began to realize that this is really huge and it's really dangerous. And since then, things have gotten substantially better. But they're playing catch-up, which of course, gives them a real challenge.
Yeah, I was wondering how COVID-19 got from Wuhan to Italy, because it's the off-season, so I can't imagine there are a lot of tourists visiting this time of year. So you think that it was actually industrial travel?
Well, there were a lot of tourists anyway. No.
Oh, really?
There were a lot of tourists, but they weren't the primary reason.
Okay. And of course, Italy recently became the first G7 nation to join China's Belt and Road Initiative. You think there's a little bit of a cautionary tale there?
Well, I don't think in terms of the virus, but there's a big cautionary tale in terms of what's happening with China and the fact that it is a dictatorship. It's very anti-American. And I think we should be very concerned. The part of what's happened is that the Chinese have signed contracts to run the port of Genoa, which is the biggest port in Italy, and to run the port of Trieste, which is the entryway to Austria and South Germany. So, you know, in the old days, if this was the Cold War and the Soviets had done that, we would have been going crazy.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we're sort of numb to it. But the Chinese are I wrote a book called Trump versus China, just outlining these are very good competitors. These are people you've got to take very seriously.
Yeah, you've been sounding the alarm about China for some time now. What do you see as the impact of this pandemic on U.S. China relations?
It'll make it worse, partly because I think we can legitimately blame the Chinese for having the Chinese government. My newsletter, which will come out later on today, talks about the degree to which the Chinese government was directly responsible for the whole disaster. And I think you have to start from there. And they lied about it. They covered it up. They allowed it to get out of control in China. They exported it to the rest of the world. And now they're going around the world blaming the United States. So I think we have a good reason to be pretty angry with them. And I've seen both the President and Secretary of State Pompeo say some pretty strong things about them. And I think it's just a reminder that these folks aren't necessarily our friends, and they certainly don't tell the truth.
Yeah, and I guess now we're hearing them say things like they were going to cut off Chinese-made medicine to the rest of the world and start hoarding manufactured goods and so forth.
Well, and what that's going to do is it's going to accelerate American companies pulling out of China and either bringing their factories home or putting them in other countries.
Right. And it just occurred to me that you've sort of been on a little bit of a coronavirus tour here, Newt, because earlier in the year, you were also in South Korea when the virus hit that country. Now, they had much greater success at nipping this killer in the bud early on. I wonder, did you notice what they did right?
They went to very aggressive policies, which we still haven't done.
Really?
For example, I was there in the early stages of the virus having come out of China, and they had a policy that when you'd go to a hotel, people would stop you on the way in, and they had a thermometer they could put up against your forehead or against your hand, and if you had a temperature, you couldn't go in the hotel.
Wow.
So they were checking every single person, and they had that kind of attitude about what they were doing, and I think as a result, they captured it early. They also had a very unusual situation. The largest center of people who had the disease were one mega church, which had actually been doing missionary work in Wuhan.
Oh,
And it had
interesting.
like 400 or 500 members who had come down with the virus because of the mission work they had done. So they could identify that center, and by focusing on it, they could isolate it and not spread from there. And so they were pretty direct and pretty tough about not letting people go off and do other things. It said, no, you're not. You've been infected with the virus, and you're not going to do that.
I wonder, do you see some flaw in the situation here in the U.S. where right now we kind of have various states taking various different approaches to this? There's not necessarily a unified approach state to state. Texas has a different plan than California has. New York has a different plan than Florida has.
I actually think that's good, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
New York has about half of all the virus in the country right now. So you need one strategy for New York. Even inside New York State, there's a huge difference between Westchester and New York City and counties upstate where no one has the virus. So you start there. Then you go out to a place like Wyoming or South Dakota or North Dakota. There are 11 states where there are fewer than 100 patients per state. The lowest is South Dakota at 30. Well, I don't think you apply in South Dakota the same rules that you apply in New York City.
Okay.
So I think the way we're going to rebuild the economy starts by being very practical and recognizing where you can and where you can't do that.
And here in the U.S., at least initially, there was some resistance on the right, particularly in libertarian-leaning circles, to aggressive government action to halt the virus. You actually wrote an op-ed addressing those concerns fairly recently. What's the argument to be made to any remaining skeptics in your party?
The argument's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Look at northern Italy and ask yourself, how many people are you willing to have die? Now, again, I'm for being more nuanced. I don't want an automatic sledgehammer taken to the whole country.
Right.
But I do think you have to take quite seriously that this is a real deal. This is not something that you can take for granted or that you can assume is going to go away.
We're going to take a quick break, and then I'll be back with more when we come back in just a minute. Folks, these are difficult times for all of us. With the coronavirus and its devastating economic impact, many Americans are finding it harder than ever to make ends meet and quickly going through whatever rainy day funds they might have saved up. So ask yourself, what would you do if your laptop crashed? How are you going to work from home without your computer? Or what if you suddenly needed essential plumbing or electrical work? Goodness knows having the whole family working and living at home is putting a lot more wear and tear on your house right now. And you can't just go without power or water, so what would you do? If staying on top of your budget and protecting your home are goals for this year, take a look at American Home Shield. They give you a plan when stuff breaks down in your home. What kind of stuff? Refrigerators, ovens, heating and air conditioning, plumbing, electrical systems. Stuff insurance doesn't cover, and stuff you don't want to mess with or go broke trying to get fixed. If they can't repair the covered item, they'll replace it or offer an alternative solution. American Home Shield founded the home warranty industry almost 50 years ago, and as the nation's largest provider, they've paid more in home warranty claims than any other company, including $2 billion in claims over the past 5 years. There's also a nationwide network of more than 15,000 licensed professional contractors, so they can find the right pro in your area to fix your problem. Coverage is available no matter how old your systems and appliances are, with plans and pricing to fit every budget. In these uncertain times, do yourself and your family a favor and buy yourself a little peace of mind. Go to ahs.com/kick today to save $50 and start protecting your home and budget from inevitable breakdowns. ahs.com/kick. That's ahs.com/kick for $50 off any plan. American Home Shield. Be sure with Shield. Limitations and exclusions apply. See plan for details. How do you feel about this idea? I think it passed in Congress today of giving Americans a $2,000 handout from the federal government. Doesn't that kind of go against everything conservatives believe in? And do you see that there is a danger that could set a precedent?
Yeah. Normally it would. Normally, I would say it would. But I would also say that the scale of what we're up against, you have got to find a way to make this transition work. This is a wartime. You have to think of this as a war.
Yeah.
You have to say what would we do in a real war, and you've got to help people get across who haven't done anything wrong. They're trapped in a real war.
Mm-hmm. And you've said that Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi think that they can blackmail Trump into accepting, quote, really dumb ideas. What do you see as the dumbest of those ideas, at least as it relates to coronavirus?
Well, I think what Pelosi did, and I think it was a big mistake on her part, is she went out and she decided this was a moment to blackmail the president and blackmail the country. And so she came in with every wish list that the Democrats in the House had ever come up with. So every radical, goofy idea they could think of was on her wish list. And I think that's what happened.
Are there any other kind of actions that you would like to see Congress enact to combat coronavirus and also the economic fallout of this pandemic?
No, I would say for the moment what I would encourage them to do is to take a deep breath and let's see. They've now passed 3 very large bills. Mm-hmm. Let's see how they work.
Okay.
That'd be my advice.
Well, before we get to the book, Iran has also been hard hit by coronavirus. And the other day you put out a tweet wondering if this might be the thing that actually leads to regime change in that country. How would you see that potentially playing out?
Well, I think for 2 very different reasons. I think one, because the people are getting sick and tired of the government not succeeding. The economy is getting worse and worse. Some of that's because of our sanctions. Some of it's because of the price of oil. But the net effect of it is really bad. Mm-hmm. And part of it is that I think the leadership of that country is much older. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I think that we have to face the reality that they may be replaced just because the virus kills them. I mean, they've had a number of senior people who've been killed.
The mullahs there aren't exactly spring chickens, I guess.
That's right.
Well, Iran plays a big role in your latest work of fiction, Shakedown, a novel. As with your previous books, it's sort of fun to speculate on which real-life politicians, world leaders, and villains inspired the characters in your book. In Shakedown, there's an Iranian general who I think bears some resemblance to the recently assassinated head of Iran's Quds forces, General Soleimani. Was that who you had in mind?
Exactly. In fact, we wrote the book when he was still alive.
Oh, yeah?
So we sort of regretted losing him. But and I think anybody who reads the book will get a real sense of why he was so dangerous, why he was so charismatic, and what a huge problem it was. Yeah. And I think that, we are faced with a very interesting effort to figure out who's going to replace him, because I think he left a pretty big vacuum in their system. But what we basically did is we took historic reality. In World War II, the United States explored whether or not you could set off explosions underwater and create a tsunami or a tidal wave, with the idea of hitting Japan with it. And then in the Cold War, the Soviets explored whether or not you could do that with a nuclear weapon. So we took that concept, and we had a Russian billionaire who was able to get access to an old Russian submarine, and we had the Soleimani character who was able to get access to an Iranian nuclear weapon, and they're going to try to bring it off of the coast and use it to wipe out Baltimore and Washington. And we thought that had sort of a fascinating potential, so that was the story. And we have our 2 heroes who had appeared originally in an earlier book called Collusion, where the Russians are trying to poison the entire U.S. Senate. And Brett Garrett is a Navy SEAL who's very human. He was shot down over Africa and was significantly burned, ended up with an opioid addiction, which he's struggling with through the book. And it's really very realistic, very modern. And at the same time, he's working with Valerie, who is actually an FBI agent, and Valerie Mayberry, and the 2 of them are trying to stop this, even though the bureaucracy doesn't believe it's real.
Yeah, and here you have a CIA director who is actually skeptical of a plot by Iran that involves a nuclear weapon. Is there a little bit of an implicit warning there about underestimating Iran's nuclear capabilities in real life?
Yeah, I mean, I've always believed that the Iranians are very dangerous. They openly, when the Iranian parliament met after Obama sent them $1 billion in cash, at their opening meeting, they were chanting "Death to America." Now,
Wow.
If their equivalent of their Congress is chanting "Death to America," I didn't take that as a positive sign.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, as you mentioned, the Russians are back in this second novel. It's just funny how whenever there's a crisis, you can always bet on Russia to somehow be involved. They're just the perennial global agitator, aren't they?
Yeah, but we may, in our next novel, we may shift gears and have the Chinese involved. So you never can tell.
Yeah.
But I think for people who are tired of worrying about the virus and tired of worrying about politics, I think that they will find that Shakedown is a pretty good story and a lot of fun, and will keep them thinking about something more that's different than the usual stuff.
Yeah, Lord knows that we need a little escapism right now. Is this your first time writing a sequel?
No, I did a series on the Civil War years ago.
Okay.
That was a lot of fun. And we earlier did a series about the Middle East. Peter and I wrote 3 books on an American fighting against the bad guys in the Middle East. I like sequels because you can build a character and people can start getting interested in that person.
Yeah, and you've built some fantastic characters in this ex-Navy SEAL and the female FBI agent. What do you enjoy so much about writing these particular characters that you wanted to revisit them for another novel? And I think you already have a third planned, huh?
Well, I get a kick out of trying to think it through and imagine the different personalities, imagine the plot line, see if you can make it exciting and at the same time realistic.
And one of the things that I've found fun about your novels is the inventive ways that you dream up for America's enemies to strike the U.S. or for assassins to murder a person. One of those ways in Shakedown is honestly worthy of a James Bond movie, I think. You actually have someone who dies by a venomous snail. Is that a real thing, Newt? Killer snails?
Yes. Yes, it is. We try to, we do a lot of research. And when we did collusion, for example, there's a whole section on the history of the Russian use of poison. And the same thing here, that this book is based on, real work that was done by both the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So we hope that they have a ring of truth to them. I'd actually been in the Soviet submarine base that we have in the book.
Oh, really?
It had been turned into a museum for a while when it was in Ukraine. But now it's in Crimea, so we returned it to active duty for the purpose of this book.
As with the previous novel, the action in the book takes place in exotic locales all around the globe, including in Italy, up north in Lake Como. Have you and your wife spent a lot of time up there since you've been living over there?
Well, we spent some time. We actually, not just at Lake Como, but across all of northern Italy. It's a beautiful area, and unfortunately right now, it's the heaviest hit by the virus. Yeah,
it's so gorgeous up there. And you make reference in here to something that you call Beltway fever. Your character talks about the hypnotic grip that D.C. has on a person, and events somehow seem more important when you're living in D.C. Now that you've been living in Italy for, I think, a few years now, do you think you're cured of Beltway fever?
Well, I am for me. I mean, I like Washington very, very much. We still have a house in McLean. Callista and I have very close ties to the Basilica. In fact, we watch it on streaming for Mass on Sundays right now because there are no Masses in Rome right now.
Oh, right.
So, I have a lot of fondness for Washington. But I have to say, as a historian, living in Rome is pretty amazing because every time you turn around, you're faced with real history.
Your wife is ambassador to the Holy See. Has she spoken with the Pope or gotten an update on him? I know that he had a bit of a cold a while back.
Well, he had a cold, but he's okay. He did not have the virus.
Well, before we go, aside from having more time to write, what's the best part about being a diplomatic spouse these days?
Oh, I get to watch her go and do all the work. I think it's cool. I mean, she's a real ambassador. She has to go and be an ambassador.
Yeah.
I don't. I'm just a guy. In fact, the State Department term for it is I am the trailing spouse.
The trailing spouse.
So I think it's great. I think it's just great.
I love it. I envy you. You're living the dream there, Newt.
That's right.
Well, again, Newt Gingrich and Peter Early's latest book is Shakedown, a novel. And I also want to encourage folks to check out your podcast, Newt's World, at newtsworld.com and wherever they like to listen. Newt Gingrich, thanks again for talking with me.
Thanks. Great talking to you.
Thanks again to Newt Gingrich for joining me on the show. Order his new book, Shakedown, a novel, on Amazon, Audible, or wherever books are sold. Check out his podcast, Newt's World, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Visit his website, gingrich360.com, and follow him on Twitter at Newt Gingrich. Times are tight right now, so what would you do if your computer broke and wasn't covered by warranty? Or you suddenly needed electrical work on your house? Do you have enough saved up to take care of sudden emergency expenses like those? American Home Shield, America's most preferred home warranty, gives you a plan when stuff breaks down in your home. Stuff insurance doesn't cover, and stuff you don't want to mess with or go broke trying to get fixed. Go to ahs.com/kick today to save $50 and start protecting your home and budget from inevitable breakdowns. That's ahs.com/kick for $50 off any plan. American Home Shield. Be sure with Shield. Limitations and exclusions apply. See plan for details. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and rate and review us while you're there. 5-star ratings and detailed reviews are one of the best ways for new listeners to discover the show. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at @KickassNewsPod and recommend us to your friends on your social media. For more fun stuff, visit kickassnews.com, and I welcome your comments, questions, and suggestions at comments@kickassnews.com. For now, I'm Ben Mathis, and thanks for listening to Kick-Ass News.